Hello, everyone. Welcome to our very first MintPress News live stream on the Rokfin channel. We're very excited to have you all here with us today. My name is Mnar Adley. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of MintPress News. And we are currently live on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Rokfin. But this live stream will be exclusive to Rokfin. So we're going to allow people to start joining us for the first couple of minutes. And we're going to ask everybody who is joining us and tuning in on YouTube and on Facebook to join us on Rokfin. We have our community manager, Ben, who is going to be sharing the link with you all on YouTube and on Facebook so that you can jump on over and head on over to the Rokfin platform to join us during this live stream. We have a very important topic to be discussing today, which is we're going to be deconstructing the crisis, the humanitarian crisis in Haiti. And so it's a very important discussion to be had today, and we hope that you'll stay with us. And we're just going to take about a minute here to allow people to join us and to hop on over to Rokfin. So if you are joining us right now, we ask that you also help us beat social media algorithms. We're obviously joining Rokfin to challenge the YouTube, Google, Facebook algorithms that are really hurting our reach as an independent media outlet. So please share this live stream where you can on pages that you manage and on your social media feeds. So we're just going to give it another minute here while people join us.
And if you are here, please give us a message in the chat as well. We might read them out if we've got time.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so again, my name is Mnar Adley. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of MintPress News, and we're so excited to have our first live stream hosted here on Rokfin. And like I said at the very beginning, we are currently live on YouTube and we are live on Facebook. We're going to be disconnecting those live streams so that you guys can all join us here on Rokfin. Right, so again, my name is Mnar. I'm going to be turning that off. And we are going to be disconnecting our stream here from Facebook and from YouTube. Or I'm sorry, yeah, Facebook and YouTube, so that we can go exclusively on Rokfin. All right. Well, we are going to get started. So here's my third time giving you guys my intro. My name is Mnar Adley. I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of MintPress News. This live stream is exclusive to Rokfin. We just disconnected our live stream from Facebook and YouTube as well. So today we are deconstructing the crisis in Haiti with two very special guests, two very important members of our MintPress team, senior staff writer and scholar of propaganda, MacLeod, and behind the headlines filmmaker and Washington, D.C. correspondent, Dan Cohen, who actually just recently returned from Haiti, and he's currently working on a documentary for MintPress about the growing resistance in Haiti to the crisis there. So thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me today.
Good to be with you, Mnar.
Good to be with you, Mnar.
All right, so as we deconstruct the crisis in Haiti, it's important to talk about the migrant crisis at the border, where images these past few weeks of Border Patrol agents on horseback whipping Haitian migrants have gone viral. And while the public was completely horrified, looking at these images that looked too eerily similar to slave patrols 200 years ago, the media, the corporate mainstream media, completely failed to provide any sort of context to the horrifying life these migrants are escaping from Haiti that is brought on from nearly a century of US colonialism and occupation of this Caribbean state. And in typical Democrat fashion, the Biden administration jumped into action to announce that Border Patrol would no longer be on horseback, as if that was the only problem. And then announcing that these migrants would be housed not at the already gruesome ICE facilities where children are separated from their families and put in cages like animals, but now at a facility at Guantanamo Bay, which is known to be a black site, the largest standing war prison in US history, of course notorious for torture, for human rights abuses, and disregard for any sort of rule of law. But of course, this is none of this is surprising considering ICE detentions under Biden have now increased 70% since the Trump administration left office. His immigration policies could now far exceed Obama's. So why exactly are we talking about this today? Of course, lacking from the entire conversation about the Haitian migrant crisis at the border is the history of US colonization, occupation, and exploitation of this Caribbean island. There is a total erasure of this history from mainstream corporate media and from our politicians, especially from Democrats who like to paint themselves as these social justice, racially woke activists for peace and inclusion. And a lot of this erasure is rooted in white supremacy and modern day colonialism that we at MintPress would like to shine a light on and deconstruct in a way that highlights the struggle for revolution to take their nation back. Haiti has gone from one of the richest nations in the world to now one of the poorest, home to the largest slums in the world, where only 30% of the population have access to running water. A nation plundered by multinational agriculture giants like Monsanto, completely exploited by US aid and the likes of the Clinton Foundation. Haiti's story is extremely heart-wrenching. Haiti, which is the site of the first successful slave revolution, has endured a long history as a victim of imperialism, suffering US invasions and occupations, coups, domestic death squads, and economic warfare. And after the assassination, most recently, of dictator Jovenel Moïse in the summer, it appears that a revolution could be brewing beneath the surface, and that the US and Haiti's elite are trying to crush before it could even get started. And so I actually want to start out by speaking with Alan. Haiti is really patient zero for imperialism. How has the US empire drained Haiti of its wealth historically?
Sure. So Haiti was the site of the first successful slave revolution in the world. In 1791, the islanders there managed to rid themselves of French oppression and create a republic. They abolished slavery. Not only did they abolish slavery, but they actually helped liberate much of the Western Hemisphere from European dominion. In fact, the Haitians sent troops and other aid to Simon Bolivar, who was the liberator of much of South America, pretty much with the only string attached being that he had to outlaw slavery in the lands that he conquered and liberated. So Haiti managed to stand up against both France, Great Britain, and the United States, three of the most powerful countries in the world at that time, and managed to beat them. And this was an extraordinary thing to happen, and something which sent shockwaves all around the world when it happened. The likes of Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Toussaint Louverture, the two perhaps the most important military leaders, those names are still known today. Unfortunately, Toussaint Louverture went to France to negotiate with France, and he was captured and killed there. That was the beginning of Haiti's descent, unfortunately. Despite managing to overthrow their colonizers, the US, Britain, and France managed to blockade the island for a number of decades, which crippled the economy and development of the place, to the point where Haitians actually, in the end, agreed to provide reparations to France for lost property, that lost property being themselves. So France did not pay reparations to Haiti. Haiti paid reparations to France. And in fact, it took them until 1947 to fully pay those debts off. And it's important to understand just how rich Haiti was in the 18th century. It produced 50% of the world's cotton and also 3/4 of the world's sugar, two crops which were incredibly important back then and still are today. Also producing indigo and coffee and a number of other highly profitable cash crops for the French Empire. In fact, that little island, or that piece of island, Haiti, produced more wealth for France than the entire Louisiana colony, which, as most Americans will know, stretched all the way from France through Montana, the Dakotas, Arkansas, Nebraska, down to Louisiana itself. And so this was an enormously important event in world history. And since it happened, the empires, France, Great Britain, and the US, have been punishing the island ever since. The US didn't even formally recognize Haiti until 1862. The reason for that was during the Civil War, and the Lincoln administration hoped that the freed slaves would all go there. It was kind of linked to the fact, to the reason why Liberia was set up in the first place. The US has played a massive role in Haiti's destruction since then. In 1914, 1914, it stole Haiti's gold reserves, and then the next year, 1915, it actually occupied the country on the excuse that the Germans, who the US were becoming increasingly worried about, this was just as World War I was starting to really kick off. They said that basically the Germans were infiltrating the island and causing anti-American sentiment. And those sorts of things have parallels to how people talk about Russia today. The US stayed there until 1934, so their troops were there for nearly 2 decades. After that, it propped up a vicious dictatorship, Papa Doc and Baby Doc Duvaliers. Those leaders were responsible for some of the worst human rights abuses anywhere in the hemisphere. They unleashed the absolutely horrendous Tonton Macoute, the death squads that patrolled Haiti out until the 1980s. Until 1991, where it was thought by Washington that Haiti had been battered enough to the point where they could actually allow a free election to happen. The US put up its favored candidate, Marc Bazin, who was a World Bank employee, who offered to turn Haiti into the Taiwan of the Caribbean. This was the propaganda we heard back in the 80s and 90s, that Haiti, if it embraced the free market and free trade, would become as rich and successful as Taiwan or maybe even Japan. But unknown to the Americans, something quite extraordinary was happening in the slums and in the mountain villages. And that was a popular movement called Lavalas, which in English translates to the flood, was really taking over Haiti. It was led by a populist priest called Jean-Bertrand Aristide, who I think has a lot of similarities with Bernie Sanders in some ways. He was organizing people around liberation theology and the idea that that poor people were not predestined to be poor for their entire lives, that they actually could and should have the power and a say in how the country was run. Aristide won the election in an absolute landslide, but very quickly the US sponsored, or at least green-lighted, a coup which overthrew Aristide. Aristide spent much of the rest of his life in Africa, banished to the Central African Republic and later South Africa. And in the 1990s, Haiti really became patient zero for imperialism. Economists trained at the best schools in the US had a complete free rein to do what they wanted. What they did was they basically opened up the islands to any US product they wanted, including US food, which was massively subsidized. These enormous agro-businesses came in, dumped their food. They actually, just on an aside, they tried to do this in Canada and Mexico, but both those countries knew that if they let all of this American food in, that would devastate their own farmers. Haiti, unfortunately, didn't have the independence to say no. What happened then was that the Haitian agricultural system, which until then pretty much supplied the country's dietary needs, was completely destroyed. This forced hundreds of thousands of people into slums all over the country, and Haiti really began accelerating its drive towards becoming the poorest nation in the hemisphere. And nowadays, Haiti has now become a place where US companies, pay Haitians 25 cents an hour to stitch up MLB baseballs, for instance. Again, though, in the early 2000s, something very interesting happened. Aristide came back again and actually managed to win another election, but he was again kicked out very quickly by the same forces that the US had been supporting for decades there. And that led to a situation where Haiti's a very, very fragile democracy descended into a complete dictatorship, to the point where Jovenel Moïse was allowed to simply rule by decree for a number of years, until this summer he was actually capped off, perhaps even with some Americans involved in it. It's still not absolutely clear what happened there. So ultimately, this is where we are right now, where Haitians are brutalized by empire. And frankly, I think it's very little wonder that so many of them are trying to leave that island and coming to the United States. There's been so much talk about this wave of immigration going on, but nobody really asks, what is the cause of this? And so often to do that, the answer comes, it's actually US policy. It's decisions that have been made in Washington, DC, which affect the rest of the continent. And so even if you're just a complete, absolute anti-immigration absolutist, you should still support changing US foreign policy completely, because if US bombs and tanks and coups still emanate throughout the region, people are going to try to leave those countries, try to flee from the devastation that US foreign policy causes.
Absolutely. And, some might argue that, okay, well, stay and fix your own country. But when you're in a situation where you're occupied by the largest military, the strongest military in the world, which is the United States, and there's really just no way, like you described, to take back the wealth, take back any sort of power, there really is no other way but to leave, especially when you're a desperate mother or father who's trying to feed their children. And there really is just, no survival and hope in this kind of country. So speaking of the recent assassination of Jovenel Moïse, Dan, you covered this for MintPress, looking at how US or Colombian paramilitaries trained by the United States are most likely behind his assassination, which really prompted us to kind of dig more into what's going on into Haiti and looking at the crisis there. So you recently just came back from Haiti. You witnessed the slums that that Alan just described and painted for us in the capital of Port-au-Prince. Explain to us and describe to us the what it is like to witness these slums and what it's like for people to be living in them.
Well, the slums of Port-au-Prince are many. They're huge. Millions of people live in absolute squalor. Well, of course, a tiny few live, in really tip-top conditions up the hill in an area called Pétionville. But in the slums, I mean, essentially there are no services. There's little running water. There's little clean water. Sewage flows onto the street. There is trash everywhere. There are piles of there are piles of trash that burn 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There are constantly people picking through the trash, looking for something to eat. And after the people pick through the trash, then the dogs pick through the trash. So, there's a huge amount of children, living in these conditions. So, I mean, there's just immense poverty. If you go to, for example, Cité Soleil, which is kind of right on the waterfront in Port-au-Prince, it's just shocking. It's, you walk around there and the sewage water and trash is up to your ankles. It's just the complete absence of any kind of state services, total abandonment, and poverty that, the likes, it's basically the worst in the world. It's pretty unimaginable for us to live in. And then you have, families living in basically tin shacks, a little shack with any materials people can get their hands on. And so, maybe it'll keep the sun out, but, rain goes right in. So there's constant flooding. Obviously, that breeds a lot of disease. And so people don't have access to healthcare. They don't have healthcare, for example. So just an extremely desperate, dire situation. And right next to Cité du Soleil, which is this slum, is the national port, where there are a huge amount of shipping containers that go out of the country on a daily basis, basically to provide, like Alan said, for example, baseballs for Major League Baseball to the U.S., electronics, clothing, this kind of thing. Basically, just sweatshop labor, and local oligarchs own them, and usually live overseas in much better conditions. And so the island of Haiti is just basically a profit factory. They just make huge amounts of money, while the people who live and work there are in these awful conditions. So the contrast, and this is something we show in the documentary, the contrast between Cité Soleil and the national port is just so shocking and so incredible. And this is really just, this isn't a failure of policy. This is the success of U.S. policy, of neoliberalism, of where you have basically a captive population basically forced to live on in wage slavery, with no ability to organize, no and horrible working conditions. And these factories are all right next to the slums, and the workers are basically people who were formerly farmers. Haiti has a long farming tradition, and starting in really the 1980s, with the implementation of neoliberal capitalism in Haiti, and throughout the 1990s and until today, basically the farming industries were destroyed by the U.S. essentially subsidizing, as Alan explained, subsidizing its own crops, its own products. So basically, Haitian farmers could no longer sell their products, were forced to dump rice, for example, and so there was a massive uprooting, and people were forced to move from the country where they had some kind of they survived those still in difficult conditions, and were forced to basically move into enormous ghettos that are not able to provide for so many people. And this is the same, this is not really unique to Haiti. This is basically throughout much of Latin America, except for countries that have come out of the grip of the US. Even if you just go to the US-Mexico border, there are factories all along the border, and huge slums of people who were farmers and basically neoliberalism destroyed their livelihoods. They went fleeing, looking for some kind of work, and the only thing that's available is factory jobs that pay very little, that offer no kind of protection, and they live in slums. So these factories that are often foreign owned or owned by local oligarchs can send their product to the U.S. So it's not like I said, it's not unique to Haiti, but that's essentially the conditions, which of course make it very, very ripe for some kind of uprising or revolutionary movement to come in.
Okay, so you're working on this documentary called Another Vision for Haiti. Talk to us about how people are resisting this sort of oligarchic takeover of the nation's wealth and resources, and also resistance to Western colonialism and neoliberalism in the country. Because you were there in the slums, seeing this sort of desperation taking place.
Right. So the documentary is called Another Vision Inside Haiti's Uprising. And Another Vision is a reference to kind of the revolutionary ideology that is kind of growing inside Port-au-Prince, inside Haiti. So given these conditions that we've just described of extreme poverty and total exploitation, with no kind of future, and no ability to have any kind of say in your future, um, basically there is a movement of, well, essentially what happens when you have a lack of state is you have strongmen arise, basically armed groups. Whoever's the strongest then controls, and then can tax the area and use that wealth for whatever purpose. Often that can turn into gangs, where basically you have kidnappers and rapists and people, who use an iron fist to control the area for their own benefit. And then they end up becoming tools of local oligarchs. And that's been the situation in Haiti for a while, in Port-au-Prince in particular. The alternative is someone may come along who says, you know what? Why are we fighting each other? Why are we killing each other, us poor people, while the oligarchs benefit and just get richer? Well, from our labor, from these factories that we work in, that our brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers work in. And so the figure that we focus on in the documentary, in Another Vision, which I've been working on with Kim Ives, I've had the real incredible opportunity to work with Kim Ives, who from Haiti Liberté, and who's been working in Haiti since the 70s, since before I was any of us were born. So it's really an honor to work with him. Kim and I basically went to Haiti and interviewed the head of this revolutionary movement. His name is Jimmy Cherizier, he's commonly known as Barbecue. If you read anything about Barbecue in U.S. mainstream media, you will come away with the idea that he's a mass murderer, that he likes to actually barbecue people, and that's why he has the nickname, that he likes to burn people alive. And that he's just, he's a killer and a terrible person, and he's actually the most dangerous, gang leader in all of Haiti. This is so, every week or so, there's a new hit piece. There's a new piece about Barbecue. I think the most recent one was like 2 weeks ago in the Daily Beast. They all, call him a thug and a gangster and all this stuff. Vice has really led the way in the demonization of Jimmy Cherizier. And so what we went to do is basically talk to Cherizier himself and examine some of the myths. Now, when I started on this project, basically I got onto this idea because when Jovenel Moïse, the former president, was assassinated, I interviewed Kim Ives about it, and his hypothesis was that Moïse was assassinated because the ruling class wanted to bring in someone who was not so embattled, who was able to really take on this revolutionary movement, either that or trigger a US-UN intervention, which as soon as the assassination happened, the next day, the Washington Post came out with the editorial board came out with an op-ed calling for U.S. intervention in Haiti. So, it almost seemed like it was like clockwork. It really was like clockwork how that op-ed came out. And so clearly, there are these calls for intervention. The Biden doctrine has been that we're not going to have direct interventions, but more going to be special forces, proxy. Stuff the public is not going to know about. And so so there's not really going to be opposition to. And that's kind of, the Obama doctrine rather than, the Bush era full-on invasions. And so, coming out of Afghanistan, Biden is unlikely to send, a military occupation to Haiti. What's more likely is they'll send a team of, trainers or, some kind of hit squad undercover to, carry out the assassination, the attack. And so we basically, Kim, that was his hypothesis. And I was like, well, can we go talk to this guy? And he said, yeah. And so we soon went we soon went to Haiti, and I, was researching everything I could, watching all of the US media. And I started to kind of, get a sense of how the propaganda surrounding Haiti, and particularly Barbecue, Jimmy Cherizier, works. Kind of, taking warfare and portraying it as all the responsibility, everything is on one guy. It really reminded, and you can't talk about the other side, really reminded me of Syria a lot, in the way that, always Assad is portrayed as this evil dictator who eats babies, while the opposition, which is far worse, they're either, portrayed as moderate rebels, or they're just not talked about at all. And you're also not allowed to talk about victims in government-held areas in Syria. Similarly, you're not allowed to talk about victims of violence in areas held by Jimmy Cherizier and his guys. So we go there and we interview Cherizier, spend a couple days with him. I ended up going twice, and that's become this documentary that we're working on. We've just released the trailer for it. I don't know if are we able to show the trailer?
Yeah, I was just about to say, let's watch the trailer. Let's take a look at it. So do you have the link, or should I share it?
I have the link. I can show it.
You can do a screen share at the bottom here next to the camera.
Oh, I think I can even do a play local video. Yeah, I believe so. Okay, let's try this. Let's see if it works. Okay. Tell me if you can see it.
You ready?
Oops, there it is. So this is the trailer for Another Vision. Are you hearing it?
Can't hear it though. I should be able to play. It's not muted. How about, can you play it from YouTube? You can share your screen from YouTube too.
Sure. Or I can just play it from my computer and share screen. Okay, share screen. Okay, I gotta allow it, I guess, here. Am I in Google? 1 second. This will be a very quick, painless. Oh, I can't do it. I have to quit in order to do it, it appears. Let's see. Are you seeing it?
Yeah.
You seeing my screen?
Yeah, we're seeing everything. Yep.
Okay. All right. Let's see. MintPress. Let's see if we can just do it this way. That's the Creole version. Here we go. Let's try.
And we should be able to hear it.
Hang on. I'm going to do it from... I'm going to do it a slightly different way. Share screen. Chrome tab. Another Vision. Boom. There we go. How's that?
Got it?
Yeah? Okay. Let's see if we can hear it. I'm going to make it full screen.
A nation in turmoil, ravaged by empire, neighborhoods at war, the state on the brink of collapse, revolution in the air, a man at the center of it all, to some, a villain.
Jimmy Cherizier alias Barbecue, li te vle guider nous non façon pour nous voler même Javel.
He's a criminal. He's not revolutionary.
To others, a hero.
4 minutes à chercher manger pour manger. He is a revolutionary leader.
C'est grâce à déporter avec Monsieur Barbecue cap fait vivre.
Join us as we seek to uncover the truth about the uprising in Haiti today.
Attention. Wait, watch out. Come here. They have to have a revolution. It's got to happen.
Very cool. So tell us, before you tell us, I just want to mention the way you described mainstream media coverage of barbecue. It almost sounds like the media, because we don't really hear about Haiti. We don't hear about Haiti, but yet we're getting this coverage coming out of Haiti about barbecue. It almost seems like these mainstream corporate media outlets who are notorious for pushing a neoliberal agenda, which is Vice News, you mentioned, the Daily Beast. I mean, these are like very much pro neoliberal organizations that promoted the opposition in Syria. They promoted U.S. intervention in Libya. So it almost feels like they're priming the public to hate this man, to dehumanize him and paint him as this mass murderer. Of course, I don't know the truth. You were there. What did people have to say when about him when you interviewed them?
Yeah, you're exactly right. There is a very concerted effort to portray Jimmy Cherizier as the kind of ultimate evil and the source of the island's problems, when everything I've seen actually shows, the opposite, that he is actually an antidote. The revolution that he's leading is an antidote. And all of the same corporate media that was, like you said, supported the opposition in Syria and Libya, and has pushed every regime change war possible, and supported Juan Guaido and these kinds of things.
Even
They're
in
all
Ukraine,
against
they were supporting like U.S. intervention in Ukraine.
Exactly. So it's this, for anybody, who's kind of, understands how propaganda works, and is, it's the same. It's kind of the same script applied to Haiti this time. And I was told, I don't want to name names, but even by kind of the anti-war left in the U.S., people were telling me before I went down there, like, oh, he's a bad guy, nobody supports him, he's a mass murderer, all this stuff. And then I found no evidence of any of that. And then when I talk to people, depending on where you go, but in general, I mean, I talked to, for example, people who owe their lives to barbecue. There was a huge attack on the neighborhood he kind of lives in and is responsible for, where 30 homes were destroyed. And about a week before, possibly hundreds of homes were destroyed by firebomb, by bulldozer, and basically by different gangs in cahoots with the police. And so they brought an armored bulldozer and just started destroying these homes and firebombing them, killed supposedly about 20 people, and made hundreds of people homeless. And I went to a shelter and spoke to these victims, and many of them told me that they were sleeping in the street afterwards, and barbecue basically opened the shelter and protects them and provides them with food. And so everything I saw kind of reinforces what they told me, and their testimonies were totally consistent. They weren't full of contradictions. And so none of these people ever make it into mainstream press. None of this aspect of barbecue's program, which is there's basically a social revolution happening inside the territory that he, along with several other guys, he's basically several other people that he's created, basically a federation, an alliance of armed self-defense groups with. There's a social revolution happening inside there. And so they were attacked, and the victims basically, a lot of them told me that they owed their life to barbecue. You saw one in the trailer. There's a blind guy who says, barbecue and his men saved my life. And it's as simple as that. But none of those people will ever make it into U.S. media, just like none of the people in government-held territory in Syria will make it into the media, just like no one who supports Maduro in Venezuela will make it into U.S. media, just like the someone who supports who's against the government in Ukraine, against the coup government in Ukraine. So it's totally one-sided and distorted coverage, and so that's kind of what we're trying to push back against with this documentary.
Well, I think it's really, and I really think it's great that you were in Haiti, because I mean, just as we talk about this, it's such an underreported area in the world. Alan, you were going to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's really interesting what you're talking about with Haiti, and how even people who are very progressive and more into a sort of anti-war left position are very much cautious about him. And it seems that it's specifically because of what they read in these sort of like hipster, faux left journals like Vice or the Daily Beast, who in the last 10 years, it seems, that have really tried to present any sort of demonstration or protest around the world as inherently valid, no matter what its agenda is, that it's, anyone, raising their fist must be in solidarity with the Occupy Wall Street movement. We saw it recently in Cuba where, this right-wing wave of demonstrations, people were being told that, don't you support the movement for Black lives in Cuba? This is just like Black Lives Matter, even though none of them give two hoots about that. It's really, just very interesting. And, somewhere like Haiti, I mean, it's kind of what you were talking about earlier, Dan, about there's a lot of universality within Latin America. There really aren't many journalists going to Haiti. And those that do tend to be parachuted in and stay for like 2 days at the Hilton Hotel, maybe meet a prearranged contact who their company, sorted out for them, who speaks English. None of these reporters who go down there are really speaking Haitian Creole. And so it's interesting that you actually talked to Kim Ives, who's a guy who's, as you said, has been there for decades and is one of the few Westerners who really speaks the language really well and seems to understand the country there. So like Mnar, I've got no position on barbecue at all, but if you and Kim are saying that he's someone to watch out for, I think that is kind of interesting. I'm certainly wanting to learn a lot more about this guy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited to get this documentary out to, kind of show what's happening there. And, when I went down there at first, I was kind of going, and I was telling Kim, I don't know, I may end up disagreeing with you on this whole thing. So we're going to just have to see. And it, turned out that everything I saw, evidence that I saw, people I talked to, when I examined the claims against barbecue, what are they sourced from? I talked to his alleged victims, his supposed victims, people, that I read were attacked by barbecue. None of them identified barbecue as who's responsible for their situation. None of them. So, it really, none of it held up. All of these claims, as so often in mainstream media, you start to examine the claims and it all turns to sand in your hand. It just kind of falls apart. And so, I interviewed the guy the figure who's behind a lot of these claims, the kind of preeminent human rights figure in Haiti. And no surprise, he is very close to the U.S. Embassy, and he has an award from the U.S. Embassy hanging on his wall that he's, very proud of. So it all comes back to, U.S. empire. The situation that Haiti is in today is fundamentally comes down to the economic system imposed by the U.S., and it has its tools in Haiti to maintain that status quo. And any time that there is some kind of revolutionary movement or figure that's capable of kind of uniting people to change their conditions, the U.S. wants to go in and basically kill them. And so right now, because of kind of the general, I don't even know if I want to say anti-war sentiment, but fatigue of being in permanent war in the U.S. Biden can't just go in. So there has to be this kind of, manufactured consent, this media campaign to portray barbecue as this monster. So then when the time comes, whether that's in a week or a year or whatever it is, then the public will be primed, and the left, the anti-war left, whatever your politics are, if you're anti-war, then that they're basically trying to stop people. This whole propaganda campaign is trying to tamp down on any possibility of people protesting and saying, no, this is the U.S. can't do that. We can't kill this guy. We need to be in support of this revolution. And so, I'm hoping that this will kind of open up some eyes, dispel some narratives, and and kind of open things up for the U.S. Dissidents in the U.S. to support the revolution in Haiti.
Well, and speaking of revolution, Haitians have been protesting for many years now. I mean, they've been protesting, they've been frustrated, they've been on the streets, speaking their truth. demanding change. Alan, you've covered their protests for MintPress before, so has Whitney Webb and others. There have been massive nationwide protests around Haiti for years now, but they've been barely covered by the mainstream press. What exactly are they protesting? I know we just kind of talked about it a little bit, but what exactly have they been protesting about? And why don't you think their protests, like the protests in Cuba, for example, like why aren't they being covered?
Well, I guess it's, in short, a nationwide rebellion against neoliberalism. I mean, if you live in Haiti, it's very different to if you live in the US. You can get away with telling Americans sort of, sophomoric phrases like, a rising tide lifts all boats and capitalism is great. But when you're actually like ground zero for capitalism and you are working in a sweatshop and you're, seeing your country being ripped away, you're living through devastating natural disasters, which are made worse by global powers intervening, when you see foreign troops, patrolling where you live, it's very hard to, actually believe in these phrases. The reality of how capitalism works is absolutely on display in Haiti. And so you actually find that most people there have a much more nuanced and intelligent critique of how the world actually works than us in the West. So these protests have been going on since 2018. They were totally nationwide. Millions of people have been involved in these things. They have shut down entire cities, trying to protest against the increasingly dictatorial rule of Jovenel Moïse, who was recently murdered, as we talked about earlier. I covered this for Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. I did a study which compared the Haitian protests with the Hong Kong protests. And I found that there was 50 times as much coverage of the Hong Kong protests than the ones in Haiti. And when you looked at the coverage of the Haitian protests, it was mostly about, 2 Americans get stranded somewhere in Haiti because of these protests. It wasn't anything to do with what was going on. It wasn't informative or anything. And the reason is kind of clear. Is like in Hong Kong, those people are kind of protesting against an official enemy state, the Chinese government. Whereas in Haiti, they're directly protesting against a US puppet. And so in that sense, it's very dangerous to let people know what is going on in Haiti if you're higher ups in Washington, because the conclusion for many people is that once they get educated about this, they might actually think the Haitians have got a point, and maybe we should start doing the same thing in the US, the UK, Germany, wherever we live. And that could be, the domino that really starts things going off. So frankly, that is why we don't hear very much about the protests going on in Haiti.
Well, and I'm glad you talked about how educated the Haitian public is about exactly what is wrong in their country. Dan, when you had returned from Haiti, that first video, I don't know if we can play it as our final video, if you want to find it.
Yeah, I can.
Because that video really shows just how informed the public is about what exactly is wrong with their country and what has destroyed their country. I mean, Dan, you're on the streets interviewing random people. And I even asked him, like, who are these people that you interviewed? You're like, honestly, it was just legit random people on the streets. And they were calling out US imperialism. They were calling out Western colonialism. They were calling out the Western corporations. They were naming names. I mean, they were saying this is all because of neoliberalism. And
right.
Can you imagine if you went down the streets in like LA or New York and asked people what was wrong with our country? Like they wouldn't even have those kinds of answers.
Yeah. Well, you'd get like, people say like Trump supporters or like, some kind of, it's like that guy instead of like the system. Yeah, that's what we'd hear. I have it queued up. There we go. Okay. So just to give a little pretext, this is in Champ de Mars. This is like the, kind of central square in Port-au-Prince. And so basically at that point, I was there about a week and a half after the assassination of Jovenel Moïse. And it was known that he was assassinated by Colombian mercenaries. And so the Washington Post had published its call for a U.S. intervention. There was a second one that was published, and they also published the neocon Max Boot saying that Haiti misses U.S. empire. and they actually want U.S. troops to come and occupy the country. And I almost wanted to like take a photo like of Max Boot's face with like the crooked hat and say, does this guy speak for you Haitians? Is he right that you want the U.S. to occupy your country? Which I didn't do that. I thought that would be a little bit too far, but yeah, I went and asked people what they thought about the possibility of U.S. intervention. So we can play at least some of it.
Oh non, nous pas besoin de protectorat. Haïti, nous pas besoin.
Pas besoin.
Non, nous pas besoin de protectorat Haïti.
Jodi an nous-mêmes nous clair, nous pas dans bagaille blanc, surtout les États-Unis. Parce que les États-Unis font nous mal dans le pays déjà.
C'est pas blanc qui a couru vini pour le fouiller bouche dans les affaires. Les n'a réglé le problème pas les blancs yo. Après réglé le problème pas yo. Yo réglé le problème pas yo la caillou.
Nous-mêmes comme des militants cap goumé pour nous chamba de système néolibéraliste, c'est pas ça nous te voulons. Choul oligarchie, c'est pas ça nous te voulons.
Nous-mêmes peuple haïtien nous te croit dans Joe Biden parce que nous te pensé c'était Donald Trump qui était diable là. Avec le résultat de l'élection, tout haïtien, c'est comme si son match Brésil avec Argentine. N'a chauffé Brésil qui c'était Joe Biden, Donald Trump c'était l'Argentine. C'est bien dommage. Le Joe Biden vient arriver président. Joe Biden continue de porter solidarité avec un régime criminel qui c'est PHTK.
Nous n'avons pas besoin d'intervention internationale, quel que soit pour nous résoudre ça. Le corps groupe OEA contribué dans ça, nous je dis là. Mettez-nous là. Mettez Haïti, surtout dans le côté nous là, je dis. Parce que je me change, 2004, après coup d'État Jean-Bertrand Aristide, 91, Américain était pilé sol là. 1915, Américain était tout sous pilé sol là. Qui ça te gagne? Rien. Plus c'est dans la misère qu'on là. C'est plus dans l'insécurité qu'on là. Parce que tout ça, parce que je dis bien, après insécurité ça, sont insécurité programmée par oligarques là avec impérialistes là. Raison qui fait tout ça, parce que la majorité des amis qui comptent sortir Haïti pas fait ça. Nous pas fait cartouche là. Côté sorti, c'est les États-Unis qui sorti. Nèg ça c'est eux même qui mettaient nous dans journée jodi a, yo fait nous pas union entre nous. Parce que qui ça lié là jodi a pour nous parler d'intervention internationale, c'est qui ça non? C'est pas vrai nous ca chita entre nous.
Jodi a, nous faisons ce qu'on appelle la prise de conscience. Prise de conscience qui s'allie, c'est tout haïtien en nous concerter nous pour nous faire une coalition pour nous dire comme ça, mais qui côté pays en pour aller, mais qui côté pays en veut arriver.
Mais c'est nous-mêmes haïtiens qui résoudre le problème nous. Nous gagnons à l'haïtienne. Je dis à ça qui est important pour nous. C'est tout haïtien qui pour chita son seul tap. Pour un moment arrivé dans le 21e siècle, ça, nous ne pouvons pas continuer à mettre espoir nous sur l'autre pays étranger. Parce que chaque pays a son propre problème. C'est nous-mêmes haïtiens qui pour chita ensemble pour nous sortir avec un résultat normal qu'après faveur peuple haïtien. Parce que en 2004, nous songeons, les États-Unis viennent prendre l'idée charismatique nous. Jean-Bertrand Aristide, je dis, c'est après le coup d'État ça qui cause Haïti vient état ça. Parce que nous avons une seule leader qui était fait Haïti, nous te voulu vin normal, c'était Jean-Bertrand Aristide et les États-Unis qui trahi peuple haïtien quand ils viennent kidnapper Jean-Bertrand Aristide avec la France, le Canada, sous protection paquet bourgeois qui va même fait ici. Qui t'a mal vivre, côté Dessalines te déclaré papa nation, n'importe l'autre pays qui se sent pas en sécurité, qui a persécuté des populations sol papa Dessalines, ou libre. Je dis à nous-mêmes, nous pas pour une intervention militaire. Nous pour une tête collée, haïtien haïtien.
Wow.
I don't know how much we want to watch there. I mean, there's still a few minutes left, but pretty obvious that everyone I spoke to is very much against U.S. intervention. I mean, there would be basically a handful of political actors, who would benefit from a military intervention. But by and large, the masses in Haiti, they understand that their situation, that their conundrum, is a result of foreign powers interfering in their country, and they know that the U.S. is responsible for not one but two coups d'états against democratically elected their president, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, over the last couple of decades, and so it's obvious. It's no secret to them. It's only mystifying to pundits in Washington, at the Washington Post, and in the Biden White House.
And what did Joe Biden say about Haiti?
Oh, back in, I think, like the 80s. I can't remember what year it was.
There's like this famous video
there's
of him.
there's a video of him saying
that video.
If there was an earthquake and in Haiti and it just kind of the water just rose up and kind of enveloped the whole island, it wouldn't make a bit of difference to the U.S. So just total crass disregard for Haitians, which
absolute arrogance. Yeah.
It's just total arrogance. But on the other hand, I think it's a little bit also in it's true in a sense, but it's also Haiti plays an important role in U.S. empire in that if Haiti, for one thing, you can never have Haiti is permanently being punished by the U.S. empire because it had a successful slave revolution. Yeah. You can't have an example as it was and and is for the rest of the world. That's not allowed. And if Haiti succeeds, then other countries think about succeeding. Maybe Puerto Rico or starts to look at starts to think about its condition. Who knows? But and then also it's kind of geopolitical, its role in the kind of chessboard of Caribbean and Latin America. I think also it plays an important part in kind of why the U.S. keeps it in the condition that it's in addition to the immense profits that it generates for the U.S. One thing I came across recently is that Haitians used to grow a lot of rice. That was all that industry was destroyed, and rice farmers are now living in slums and working in factories or not working at all. And where does Haiti's rice come from? A lot of it comes from Louisiana. So it's grown in Louisiana and then sold there. So it's U.S. rice. So it's basically a captive market. The U.S. has Haiti as a captive market, and you can see in the trailer, we're in this slum called La Saline, and you can see this total poverty, with these shacks and awful conditions, and then you see like these bags of American rice. So really kind of captures the whole conundrum of foreign aid in Haiti.
It's just such a heart-wrenching story when you think about what has taken place in Haiti. It really reminds me somewhat of what took place in the Congo, where like the first official humanitarian intervention or occupation, I don't even know what you can call it, took place when the country was basically captured by these European nations, and the people there were completely enslaved, and all of their rubber was captured by these by these Europeans, and the people there were completely just ravaged, and it became one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, known in our history. And so Haiti really, really reminds me of that kind of situation. And of course, because of this arrogance by U.S. empire and just this idea of superiority and white superiority over the Haitian people, it's really, really tragic what they have lived through. So that's going to be a wrap for today's live stream. This live stream was exclusive to Rokfin. It's going to be exclusive to Rokfin for 3 days. I believe we talked about 3 days, and then we will be uploading this back up to our YouTube channel, and we will also extract the audio and upload to our Spotify channel under our Mintcast podcast. And so we appreciate everybody listening and joining us today. And that's a wrap. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mnar.